Amen. Thanks, Kath. Would someone be okay to hand out the handouts? Someone be okay to do that? Derek, brilliant, thank you. Again, we don't have one each, so if you've got it on your device from the email I sent out earlier, or you've got a copy that you printed out yourself, please use that. And there's pens and more paper at the back if you need that. So let's have a quick recap to where we're up to. So we're looking at the story of creation and how that's recapitulated through the Bible and through the people's lives within the Bible. How it's built upon, how we get layers upon layers of it, and ultimately how Jesus is going to rescue that story. So in the first week, in the first session, we looked at the original creation story in Genesis 1. We looked at how chaos exists and how God creates through peace, through movement, through word, through his spirit. And we looked at humanity's responsibilities in having authority and dominion over that creation that God has crafted out of the chaos, that he's brought good order out of chaos. And then in the second session of that first week, we looked at what it means to be made in the image of God. So we sort of narrowed in on humanity. So we used sort of metaphors and ideas like royalty and idols, and icons was mentioned as well. And what it means to have the breath of God within us. And then the first session last week, we looked at the fall and how we screw all that up, basically. How we fall from a position of privilege. Great, thanks, Derek. Cheers. So even though we are described in terms like we are idols in some sense, we fall ironically through idolatry. We project onto the tree of knowledge things that we're never meant to project onto it. We idolize the tree and we fall in that way. And there's also sort of this sort of ironic tragedy in trying to usurp God, trying to kill God, and all that we do is vanquish the breath of God within us. We try to commit deicide and we commit suicide. And also how we fail to subdue the chaos monsters, right? The serpent sort of represents these chaos monsters, and we fail to guard the good creation against the serpent. And how the serpent as well draws out the sort of potential deceit that's already lying within our hearts, how we already mistrust God, and the serpent's role is partly, at least, to draw that out of us. And this is what we need rescuing from. So that's sort of the original creation story on which that we can then build further stuff and how it collapses. And then the last session, last week, we started to add layers to this narrative. So we looked at how events like Noah's flood and the Tower of Babel and Abraham, they are creation events, they're creation and fall events. And then we looked in detail at the Exodus story, about how the Pharaoh is meant to uphold the good creation, but he falls in a way, and he lets the creation descend into Isfet, into chaos, and how out of this, Moses brings the people of Israel into a good new creation. And we also saw the first example, so if we're talking about stories and how stories are formed, we saw the first real concrete example of a person, Moses, playing a role within the story and deliberately taking on a role and acting out as if it's a drama, a piece of theatre. In short, I mean, he acts as the true image of God, right? This is what the true image of God should do. And then we finished sort of last week with the people whom God has chosen to continue this new creation, to begin this new creation, walking through the dry land in the Red Sea. And then behind them, the waters collapse on the chaos monsters, the Egyptians, swallowing them into the primordial chaos from which they came. So that's where we've left it. So we've had this new creation where they've walked through dry land, through the Red Sea. But we haven't had a fall of that creation yet, so let's do that. Let's bring us crashing back again. So we're going to look at what I've called a desert fall, like the fall in the wilderness, how they have this potential new creation at the very least, and how it collapses, or one of the ways in which it collapses. Because human beings are unoriginal, right? We never seem to learn. And this is one of the key things that we learn in the Old Testament, is that, do you remember I described it like a roller coaster, where we fall and they get stuck in a loop-the-loop? And the loops are slightly different, like each creation and fall event is slightly different. And in some ways you get little bits of progress and little bits of back steps. But ultimately, what we see is a repeat of the same mistakes again and again and again, because we try to do it in our own strength. We try to do these things in our own strength, and so we fall. And this is what we'll see again. It's Eden rebooted, right? To use another film term. This is a reboot, and it's not a very good one. So we're using film terms a lot in this series to sort of get this idea of how the story is told, and we're going to talk about props in this session. Does anyone know what a prop is in a film? What's a prop? An object or a thing. Right, yeah, so a hat or a staff or something, like something that the actor uses to help with the story. So this is what we're going to look at in this session. But to set up this fall event, I think I probably have to successfully argue that the wilderness in which the Israelites find themselves is a type of Eden, right? Because it doesn't look like it. Like if you read the Exodus story, or like all the way through the Tanakh, the Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, it doesn't look like Eden very much, does it? So I'm going to hopefully argue successfully that it is a type of Eden, or at least a potential Eden. It was meant to grow into a type of Eden. So there's an assumption with a lot of, particularly Old Testament scholars, that the Promised Land, so Canaan, that they're headed to, that is definitely a new creation type place, right? That's kind of a consensus. And it is, but what's really interesting is that Exodus talks about the wilderness as part of the Promised Land. It's always meant to be part of the Promised Land. So Exodus 20, or Exodus 23, sorry, it sets the boundaries of the Promised Land. It says it stretches from the Red Sea, which we've just come through, to the Sea of the Philistines, and from the desert to the river. The wilderness is part of the Promised Land, according to Exodus. And you could also maybe say it another way, that Canaan is an extension of the Promised Land that begins at the Red Sea.
What verse in Exodus?
That's Exodus 23, verse 31. So all these references will hopefully be on your handout as footnotes. So you'll see like so in the bottom corner here we've got like a little 1, so that'll point you to footnote 1. So hopefully references like that should be in there. So the wilderness text can be considered also maybe a type of transitional creation. If you're not willing to say that this is Eden, because it doesn't look like Eden, we can at least say that it's a transitional creation where it's meant to grow into Eden, or an Edenic sort of place. So a guy called Terence Fretheim, who's a brilliant Old Testament theologian, he talks about the ways in which you start to see a gradual movement to transform the wilderness into a new creation. And I think actually that new creations are always gradual. I think we see this in our own lives, right? Like when we become Christians, is everything fixed instantly? And we might have a high. We might have like this instant sort of, I'm saved. Does all our sin, all our rubbish, all our junk go away? No, we are gradually transformed more and more into the image of God. And I think this happens with all creations, really. They come into being gradually. So Fretheim talks about, and again these references will be in your handouts, and the sort of cross-references back to the plague narratives, where he says that when Moses they have these poisonous waters, and Moses makes them pure with his staff, and it's almost like a reversal of the Nile that turned to blood. He heals the same waters that struck them with. He struck them with the staff, and he heals them. It rains bread instead of hail. God covers the land with quail instead of locusts. So we have this sort of gradual move, and at the center of this new creation is the tabernacle. Now the tabernacle is sort of if this is a transitional creation, maybe we could say that the tabernacle is a transitional temple. It's a tent temple, and it's sort of a precursor to the permanent temple in Jerusalem. And it's sort of this focal point of new creation activity from which everything else is meant to blossom, and the wilderness around it is supposed to be transformed. So there are a few references, and again these should be in footnotes, about new creation language that's used in the building of the tabernacle. So Moses employs this guy called Bezalel to build the tabernacle. And it talks about the Spirit of God moving over and through Bezalel. It's like the Spirit of God moving over the creation. And the breath of God being in this guy. He's the image of God to do this. There are references to Moses being satisfied with what's been created. It's sort of like this it is good motif that we get in Genesis 1. And there are 7 divine acts and 7 divine speeches of Moses through Exodus, so maybe paralleling the days of creation. And a guy called Philip Budd makes the point that in ancient Semitic mythology in particular, though in other ancient Near Eastern mythology as well, the desert, like the chaotic waters, is seen as this seat of primeval chaos. So the wilderness that they are in is meant to be conquered in some way, maybe, at least tamed and subdued and transformed into good creation. And so there's this wonderful passage in Deuteronomy that talks about this kind of thing. It says, God sustains Israel in a desert land and in a howling wilderness waste. So that word tohu is the same word that we have in Genesis 1 verse 2 for the earth being formless and void. This is the place that Israel find themselves in, this waste place. As an eagle stirs up its nest and hovers over Rachav, its young, so God hovers over Israel effectively. And that hovering over is the same word again in Genesis 1 verse 2 for God's Spirit hovering over the chaos. The wilderness is meant to be transformed into creation. And the description of the tabernacle is not that dissimilar really to Eden. So it's meant to be guarded from this chaos outside. And it's meant to, and I think Eden was meant to do this as well. It was meant to grow and meant to boom out and sort of transform gradually, like ripples. And I think we get a hint of that in the Eden narrative with these rivers that flow out of Eden to distant lands. This is good things going out from Eden to distant lands. And we know that the distant lands outside Eden are dangerous. Like in Genesis 4, after the fall, we get the Cain and Abel story. And it says in, I think it's verse 14 of Genesis 4, that the land outside Eden is filled with wild and murderous individuals. This is a chaotic place. But I think Eden is meant to grow out, and so the tabernacle is meant to grow out. So what you see there is sort of this fine balance, and I think we have it in our own world really, this fine balance. We see it with the church a lot, I think, between guarding ourselves from the wild and waste outside, as we see it, and being able to go into it and conquer it peacefully. And it's this sort of tension that we have. How do we protect ourselves while at the same time going out into it and making order from chaos? So this phrase that we have in Eden, guarding and keeping, or guarding and tending. They're supposed to guard the garden and tend the garden to help it to grow. It's a tension that we have. There's a great verse in Isaiah 51 verse 3. It says, Yahweh will comfort Zion. So Zion, the name for Jerusalem. But it applies to Israel as a whole, I think. Yahweh will comfort Zion. He will comfort all her waste places. He will make her wilderness like Eden, her desert like the garden of Yahweh. The tabernacle is also really important as the resting place of the law. So, you know, the law that Moses brings down from Sinai, and it goes into the Ark of the Covenant, and the Ark of the Covenant goes into the tabernacle, into the Holy of Holies. And Israel is asked to keep the law, just as Abraham is asked to keep the way of Yahweh, just as Adam is asked to keep the garden. So Israel is tasked with keeping the law. And just as, so there's a really interesting parallel. So when the Ark of the Covenant goes into the tabernacle, it's guarded by cherubim. Now, cherubim aren't like these little children playing harps on clouds that we get. They're not like little cherubs. Cherubim are like really fearsome creatures in mythology. They're really huge beasts that look a bit like lions, maybe, with wings. And there's two of them in the Holy of Holies, and they guard, at least in part, the Ark, which contains the law. Now, it's interesting because there's the cherubim that guard the garden as well, after Adam is expelled. And it says that they guard the way to the tree of life. So when it talks about Adam guarding the garden, maybe ultimately what his role was to guard the way to the tree of life. And having failed in that, cherubim take his place. So is the law in some way the equivalent of the tree of life, maybe? Is there some parallel in that? The other obvious comparison is the law is placed in an ark. What else is placed in an ark? In the story of Noah, we have animals that are protected by an ark. So perhaps the law is also equivalent to the whole created order, potentially. Like the law that tells humanity how it should live, how it should act in the world, how it should bring into being good new creation. It's protecting the whole created order by doing that. And it's a tree of life. It brings good things. And Leviticus 26 says that the reward for the Israelites for keeping the law is that they will be fruitful and multiply. Is this a familiar phrase? It means that they have succeeded in being a part of the good creation. This is what they're commanded to do in Genesis 1 and in various other places that we've already looked at. So now let's look at the fall event in the wilderness. And if you're not persuaded that the wilderness is some type of Eden or like a prototype Eden or is meant to grow into Eden, fine. I've tried my best to give you some persuasive points. So we'll move on to the fall. You could probably pick a few. The golden calf will probably be the obvious one. That's sort of the, when I put that drink, I'm really thirsty. I've left it over there, never mind. Yes, the golden calf is kind of an obvious one, and it's sort of idolatry, so we get links back to Genesis 3, fairly obvious. But I'm going to go for another one because it has even more explicit links to Genesis, and also has really clear links forward to Jesus as well. So that's helpful. Would someone read the Bible for me? Actually, no, because no one else has got a microphone, so I'll read. We've got a Bible. Oh, brilliant, thank you. So this is a passage from Numbers 21, if you want to follow along. Helen, would you be able to grab me a drink, actually? Is that okay? Just some water. Thanks. So Numbers 21, starting at verse 4. So from Mount Hor, they set out by the way to the Red Sea to go around the land of Edom. But the people became impatient on the way. The people spoke out against God and against Moses. Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? For there's no food and no water, and we detest this miserable food. Then the Lord sent poisonous serpents among the people. And they bit the people so that many Israelites died. The people came to Moses and said, "We've sinned by speaking against the Lord and against you. Pray to the Lord and take away the serpents from us." Thanks. So Moses prayed for the people. And the Lord said to Moses, "Make a poisonous serpent and set it on a pole, and everyone who's bitten shall look at it and live." So Moses made a serpent of bronze, put it on a pole, and whenever a serpent bit someone, that person would look at the serpent of bronze and live. Thank you. Right. So are people familiar with this story? It's slightly more obscure than the stories we've done so far. So this is part of this roller coaster where we have new creation fall. This is what's happening here. But there are subtle nuances and differences that we'll look at, which will help us sort of moving forward. So we're going to see a few things that we haven't seen before, and some very familiar things, unfortunately. So building up to this, from about chapter 11 onwards through to this chapter in 21, we have I counted about 10 separate instances of unbelief or murmurings against God and against Moses, and they're almost synonymous. It's almost like Moses is still in this role of God, almost. And there's outright rebellion. And a lot of it sort of centers around distrust of God, like Adam and Eve. They distrust his motives. And there's also a pining for the food of Egypt. They complain about food a lot, right? They're like teenagers. And that's almost similar to Adam and Eve as well. Like, they lust after a food that they're denied. And this is sort of a root of the problem. It uses a picture. I don't think food is actually a genuine issue. It's almost like they have this distorted view of their situation. Because like Adam and Eve, they try and grab something, a divinity, that in part they already have, but actually getting it, and it says that they get it, they get what they want, right? God says, but they've become like one of us. It doesn't fulfill them. They get what they want, and they don't want it anymore, right? They're like, actually, this isn't great. And this would be the same with the Israelites, right? If they got the food of Egypt, if they got to go back, they wouldn't be very happy about it. Like, they'd be slaves again. There's no freedom in that. And so these complaints sort of escalate in seriousness until we get to this story in Numbers 21. And the complaint that we get at the start, they complain to Moses and they complain to God, and they hate the wilderness and they hate the miserable food. And it's sort of this summation of all the complaints that have gone before it. And in response, God sends serpents into the camp. It's really interesting. So again, we have this idea of people being entrusted to guard a new creation, and they fail to protect it from these Ophidian serpentine invaders, right? So you have Adam and Eve, there's two of them, and a serpent comes. You've got all these people, and loads of serpents come. Maybe there's an escalation, maybe there's more serpents because there's more people. But they fail to deal with the attack, right? They just absolutely fail. I think they probably could have booted those serpents out, but they're so bothered about their complaints that they don't dismiss them out of hand as they should. And the serpent's venom as it bites is sort of the natural consequence of this sin. They are distrusting God. They are working against the things of God. They're not bringing into being the good new creation out of this potential. Instead, they're complaining about the situation they find themselves in. And so this is sort of a natural consequence of sin again. What else do I want to say on that? Yeah, I don't need to say that. So let's think for a second about the serpents in the passage, how they're described, and then we'll get on to like the salvation moment, which gives us some hope. So this first word that's used for serpents in the Old Testament, we're familiar with, right? It's Tananim, chaos monster. We had it with Aaron's staff. We have it in Genesis 1. We have it in a lot of the Psalms and things. But that word isn't anywhere in this story. We don't have Tananim. We can forget the Tananim for a second. So instead we have these two words. First is Nakash, which again we should be a bit familiar with. It's the word that's used when Moses' staff turns to a serpent. It's the word used for the serpent in Genesis 3. It's a slithery creature. It's an animal. It's just a snake. And then we have this other word, saraf, that we'll look at a bit more, because saraf is a really interesting word to use. So saraf's an adjective. It's not really a noun. It's an adjective describing the snake. It means like copper-coloured or poisonous or fiery, that kind of idea. And in other biblical references, so they're on the screen, this word is always translated serpent. It clearly means serpent in those contexts. But there is a place in the Bible where saraf is not translated serpent. I'm going to read that passage out, and it's clear, I think, why the translator is reluctant to translate it as serpent. So the passage is Isaiah 6, and starting at verse 2. I saw the Lord, so this is Isaiah speaking. I saw the Lord seated on a high elevated throne. The hem of his robe filled the temple. Seraphim stood over him. So it's not translated as serpents, it's translated as seraphim. It's not translated at all, right? He just uses the word. He's like, I don't really want to say that there were serpents attending God in the temple. I'm going to say seraphim and hope no one asks me about it later. Seraphim stood over him. Each one had 6 wings. With 2 wings they covered their faces, with 2 they covered their feet, and they used the remaining 2 to fly. They called out to one another, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord who commands armies. His majestic splendor fills the entire earth." The sound of their voices shook the door frames, and the temple was filled with smoke. I said, "Too bad for me. I am destroyed, for my lips are contaminated by sin, and I live among a people whose lips are contaminated by sin. My eyes have seen the King, the Lord who commands armies." But then one of the seraphim flew towards me. In his hand was a hot coal he'd taken from the altar with tongs. He touched my mouth with it and said, "Look, this coal has touched your lips. Your evil is removed. Your sin is forgiven." It's fascinating, right? What a weird story. What a weird vision, maybe, that Isaiah is having. So the first thing to say is that seraph or seraphim is not the same as tananim, right? Then it's not like synonymous. But there are clear sort of mythological comparisons to be made. So this is I don't know how well you can see it, but this is a relief found in Syria, a place called Tel Halaf. So this creature has 6 wings, 2 covering the face, 2 covering the feet. Yeah, go for it, thanks Derek. And 2 to fly. And in his hands, and you can't really see it very well on there, he's holding 2 serpents. So this is it seems like this is a well-known mythological creature, right? Or like at least mythological motif. And there's a precedent in Egypt as well for a creature similar to this. And precedents found in Egypt are always really key and really interesting, because the Israelites have been in Egypt for 400 years, right? They are steeped in Egyptian culture. So if we find things in Egypt that we later see in Israel, I don't find that surprising, that they would adapt this kind of language and this kind of image. It's sort of like you have some Scandinavians who travel over to America in the 1700s, and many generations later, the family emigrates back to Sweden, right? It's like expecting that family that's emigrated back to Sweden not to have any American culture in their lives, not to have any American cultural references. Of course we should expect some Egyptian stuff in the Israelite culture. But it's how they adapt it that's key. So this is a precedent in Egypt. So this is the throne of our old friend Tutankhamun, if we remember him from last week. And on the side of the throne, forming the armrests, there's a creature, a serpent with wings, called a uraeus. Similar to Isaiah's description. And actually, even the name Saraf might be an Egyptian word. So there's an Egyptian word, Sarf, which is very similar. My pronunciation of ancient Egyptian might be worse than my pronunciation of ancient Hebrew. But Surf is it's another mythological creature, like it's something like a dragon or a griffin, this kind of thing. So it's not a serpent, but the connections with like a chaos monster type creature, like a dragon and a serpent, they're very similar. So we've got similar sort of ideas going on, and the linguistic similarities maybe a bit more than a coincidence. So going back to Isaiah, it raises a really obvious question: what are these kind of creatures doing, serving God? Right? What are they doing, worshipping God? What are they doing, atoning for Isaiah's sin by putting the coal against his lips? So, I mean, you could draw a few conclusions, right? Like, you could say, well, this is symbolic of God's control over the chaos, right? He's he's drawn these monsters into part of his good creation. You can maybe say that it's a vision of an eschatological or like end time future perfect creation, where serpents and chaos monsters and these kind of creatures are brought back into the fold. They are redeemed, and you get this kind of image later in Isaiah 65, where it talks about a good new creation, and serpents are included in it. It's Nakash in Isaiah 65, but the same sort of idea is present. And this issue of sin in Isaiah is really interesting, because if we're looking at, and don't forget that we're looking at Numbers 21 and why we're using this word saraph in Numbers 21, and I'm using Isaiah as sort of a bit of a keystone to try and help us work that out. Both Numbers and Isaiah deal with sin, but there's a difference, right? So in Numbers, the serpents, the saraph, bite the Israelites, and the Israelites die. And the people who aren't dying repent, and they're like, "Oh, please save us." Now in Isaiah, the response of the seraphim is markedly different, right? So Isaiah recognizes his sin, and the seraphim flies over and takes a hot coal, and he atones for or redeems Isaiah's sin in some way. He purifies him. So in part, that might be due to Isaiah recognizing his sin before he's had a chance to be bitten, maybe. So he repents before he starts getting bitten, so he can be redeemed. Whereas in Numbers, they sort of get bitten and then they're like, "Oh, we're really sorry." Another possibility, I think, is that Isaiah represents this sort of hopeful progression in the story. So we have these three serpentine sort of things dealing with sin. So we have Genesis 3, where they're not bitten by the serpent, but in a metaphorical sense, they kind of are. Like the serpent leads them to bite the apple, and that's how sin comes in. And there's not really much hope of salvation in Genesis 3. I mean, there's a little hint, and we'll get to that next week. But it's sort of like, you've eaten of it, so you will die. There's no real coming back from this. In Numbers, they're bitten and they repent, and there is a bit of a hope of salvation. Like, actually, there's instant salvation. Moses puts the serpent on the pole and they can look at it and be saved. In Isaiah, he doesn't even die from his sin. He recognizes it and he's saved before there is even a consequence for it. So there's almost this progression. So in Genesis you have like this obliteration. In Numbers you sort of have a preservation maybe, and in Isaiah, I don't even know what you call that, he's almost like immune to it. It's sort of like this eschatological hope for the redemption that's going to come to humanity. To the point at which sin no longer has any hold over humanity, maybe. Maybe we could say it like that. So now we've got like this bit of background on the creatures and what's going on when they bite the Israelites. They are the result of the Israelites' sin. They bring death because of the Israelites' sin. So next this happens. So the Lord says to Moses, "Make a saraph and set it on a pole. When anyone who's bitten at it looks at it. When anyone who's bitten looks at it, he'll live." So Moses made a bronze nakash and put it on a pole. It's interesting, right? Like, God tells him to make a saraph and he makes a nakash. What's going on here? It's kind of similar, I think, to last week where Moses' serpent turns into a nakash. It's like this dress rehearsal thing, and then Aaron's turns into a tananim when he's on the stage, and it's a real thing. This is almost the reverse of that, where you've got the real thing, the saraph, the poisonous snake, and then Moses makes an approximation of it, like the likeness of it. This is where this word prop comes in. It's almost like he's made a prop, right? So if you were making a film about Tutankhamun, for instance, you wouldn't use his actual throne, right? That would be daft. You'd make a throne that looks like it. And that's almost what Moses is doing here. He makes something that looks like what's killing them. He makes a likeness of it. So Gregory of Nyssa, who's this 4th century theologian, church father that I might be a little bit in love with, he is amazing. You read anything and everything you can by Gregory of Nyssa. He says that, I don't want to misquote him, so he says, the real serpents are rendered powerless by the image of a serpent. The real serpents are rendered powerless by the image of a serpent. And that's something really interesting that's going on. And to all intents and purposes, this image works in a similar way to an idol, right? So Moses hasn't created the precise thing. So as an idol is the image of a god, so Moses has created the image of something that's killing them. It mimics its appearance and it's imbued with its qualities in some way. So we said that seraph is an adjective meaning, and part of it is copper-coloured. So Moses makes a copper-coloured or bronze nakash, a serpent, to mimic how it looks. Do I have time to do that? Yeah, so this might be like a little bit of a tangent, but I found it helpful. Partly because I really love literature and the ways in which people write things. So I found this fascinating. So partly what this taps into is this idea that's common in the ancient Near East called sympathetic magic. And a lady called Karen Randolph Jones describes sympathetic magic as the idea that the fate of an object or person can be governed by the manipulation of its exact image. So it's like a voodoo doll type idea, right? So this is really prevalent in the ancient Near East. And there's lots of magical language going on in this passage in the Hebrew, and it's really clever. So bronze serpent are these words in Hebrew. And so if you take away the dots and the lines from below the letters, so these are the way that we append verbs to the consonants in Hebrew to make it readable. You can see how similar these words are, right? So the words for bronze serpents are nekashef, nakash. Really, really similar words, nekashef, nakash. And words repeat themselves a lot more than they need to in this passage. So the word bite repeats itself a lot. And a guy called Victor Horowitz did a whole sort of digging into this, and he talked about how it almost sounds like a magical incantation, like mumbo jumbo. It's like nekashef, nakash, bite, 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 nekashef, nakash. And added into this, there's lots of repeating of sort of S sounds, so this kind of thing. And Horowitz, I think he counted like 19 in just 3 verses. And Horowitz says, like, if you read this in Hebrew and you don't hear the hissing of snakes in this passage, you must be deaf, right? It's fascinatingly written. And it sort of adds to this idea that what we're creating here is some sort of performance art, where you have Moses building a prop or a model, and you have these literary sort of devices, and you have these allusions to magic, which is kind of a performance, right? It's really interesting that that this kind of stuff is going on in the passage. And the bronze serpent functions as this kind of visual aid, I think. So it's this physical representation of this unseen mechanism to bring salvation from the actual serpents. And the serpents themselves represent sin in some way, right? So the bite of sin brings death. And what's really interesting, I think, is that ordinarily you read a passage like this where they're staring at a bronze serpent and you think, this is idolatry, right? So we mentioned the golden calf. And the golden calf is definitely idolatry. Like they make this calf that they say is God, and they worship it, and it's idolatry. But this is different, right? This isn't idolatry. This actually brings salvation. It's not like the idolatry that Adam and Eve had with the tree of knowledge, where they project onto the tree something it could never give them, and it was never meant to bear. They project their hopes and expectations, and maybe their fears, onto it. It's an idolatry. But this isn't like that, because they look at the serpent and they're actually healed. It actually works. Like the word that we use in theology would be efficacy. It has efficacy. It's an act that works. And Let's see. Is there anything else I want to say? Yeah. So the key difference, I think, is that with the golden calf, the people make it for selfish ends. And they do it to grab something for themselves. With the serpents, it's different. God commands them to build it. And that's a really key difference. He is the one offering salvation through it. He is the one that tells Moses to put it on a pole. And there's a really interesting thing that goes on with the verb, where it says, he looked at the serpent and lived. In Hebrew, that's an imperative form of the verb. It's, he was made to look at the serpent and live. So it's almost like God averts their gazes to the serpent, and that brings salvation. He forces them to look at it, right? They don't want to look at it. Why don't they want to look at it? Why don't they want to look at it? Because it's in the image of their sin. They are forced to look at that which is killing them. They're not looking at representation of God, right? Which is kind of what you'd expect. Like, to get salvation, you expect to look at a representation of God. Instead, they're forced to look at a representation of the very thing that is killing them. It's symbolic of the venom, of death, of their sin. And something really interesting happens, I think, to them. I think that in looking at it, they recognize their helplessness. They're trying to do stuff in their own strength. And they recognize, actually, I can't. I see my sin up there. And something really interesting happens, I think, that when you display this kind of thing. It loses its power. It's sapped of it. The venom is no longer poisonous. So Paul talks about Jesus nailing principalities and powers to the cross and shaming them and humiliating them. They lose their power when they're put on display like that. Because what they've done is, so we talked in the fall session about how Adam and Eve commit this thing called homo incurvatus in se. Do you remember this phrase? This Latin phrase that means a turning in of the human being upon himself. They become narcissistic, essentially. They do things for their own ends. They try to grab for themselves. And you get this kind of idea with the people in the wilderness as well. They're trying to get stuff for themselves. They're complaining about food, and they're moaning about their conditions and all this sort of thing. It's selfish, when what they should be doing is building a good new creation and rescuing people, right? Being a light to the nations. And what happens when they're forced to look at the serpent is that they are forced to gaze upwards and outwards beyond themselves. I think what's happening here is God taking a turned-in human being and forcing them outwards again and looking at their own sin. And we're going to finish this session just with a question, really. Is there anything going on in your life that echoes this? Right? Is there something that you're doing that you know is wrong? Like complaining about food, maybe. But the weather. You complain about the weather all the time.
What we do.
Yeah, the British. Yeah, look after your own sin. Don't worry about it. So do we complain? Do we keep doing stuff? So Paul says that he keeps doing the things he does not want to do, and he doesn't understand why. I think we all do this sort of stuff, where we're sort of addicted to behaviours. Have you considered taking that thing and displaying it? Putting it up on a pole, right? If you're addicted to watching Jeremy Kyle or something, right? Shall we call that a sin? I don't know. Maybe take something that's definitely a sin in your life. Sorry, Jeremy. But take it and in some way display it and gaze at it and look it full in the face and recognize it for what it is. Because what I found with sin in my own life is that I sort of keep it in the periphery of my vision because I don't want to look at it. I want to ignore it. I want to pretend that actually I'm not doing that, even though I'm doing it daily. What would happen if I looked it full in the face? I feel like it might lose its power. I feel like that might be a step towards recovery. And this is what alcoholics do, right? The first step in Alcoholics Anonymous is to admit that you've got a problem. Just by going there for a start, they're looking it full in the face, and it rids it of some of its power. So let's take a drinks break. And what sort of drinks? Heavily caffeinated drinks, because that's what I'm addicted to. Really strong coffee. And we'll come back in, so we say 15 minutes, we'll come back at 22. And we'll crack on with the second session. It'll tap into a few more of these ideas. And we'll have some ministry time at the end, so you can, if you want to work some of this out, you can do right at the very end. You can just sit on your own and pray at the moment if you want, but we'll come back at 22. Right, so we're going to move on. So some of the stuff that we've done in the last session, again, it's sort of, bits of it you'll be thinking, why on earth have we done that? But everything that I've tried to do there is foundational, and hopefully transformative in some way, but also foundational for stuff that we're going to do in this session and for later on. So we're going to move on to this final session today. And that should be 3.2, I think. So this is going to be the last session that we have in the Old Testament. And so after this we do Jesus. Woohoo! So in some ways, this whole 3 weeks, all these 6 sessions have been foundational for understanding what Jesus is going to do. So we'll move on to Jesus next week, and I'm really looking forward to that. I'm kind of excited about doing that. But hopefully you're starting to make a few connections already, if you're familiar with stuff that Jesus has done and the stories of Jesus, and I imagine you probably are if you're here, maybe you're starting to make some connections already. And I spoke with a few people over the break, and they're starting to say, well, does this tie into this? Does this? And yeah, great. Like, I want you to make these sort of connections. I want you to start to see these language things and these motifs and these themes being played out in the life of Jesus. So we're going to do one last thing, and this is going to tap in very much this idea, some of the ideas that we've built on of how you create a story. Things like method acting, things like sets and props and this kind of idea, and how you act out this stuff. And does it have this word efficacy? Does it work? Can you do things like this and it actually has some effect in the real world? So you might look at the title for this one and like, either I don't know those words, or what's those words doing together? It makes no sense. So the film term at the bottom is mise en scène, which is a French term, and it literally just means everything that's in the scene. So everything that's in the shot. So that's everything from props to actors to lighting. The whole thing that's within the frame of the camera, that is mise en scène in film language. So it doesn't include stuff that's behind the camera, like the director. And so what you get is this idea of a fully loaded set with people walking about and acting upon it. And that's what we're going to look at. And I'm going to say it's a type of theatre called sacramental theatre. So what would we say a sacrament is? And as good Anglicans, a lot of you should know what a sacrament is. Who can tell me?
An outward visible sign of an inward and spiritual grace.
Wow! Did everyone catch that? An act with a visible... An outward
visible sign.
And visible sign.
Inward and spiritual grace.
Of an inward and spiritual grace.
That's the catechism.
Never gone to ordination. But it's one of the catechisms. Yeah, so it's this... Can you put it in layman's terms, David?
Yes, you're touching mystery, but it's real. It does something.
You're touching mystery, but it's real. It does something. So very often it involves an act of some sort, or maybe words like a confession. And the number of sacraments you have depend on denomination you have. Catholics have more than we do, and so on. So baptism would be like a classic example of a sacrament. So it's this image of going under the water and coming out. It represents dying and rising with Christ, and other stuff as well. But it's this idea that it has real value. It changes something spiritually within you by doing this outward thing, which is that's the catechism, right? And depending on your denomination, will depend on how efficacious you believe this to be, how much it works. So some people would say, well, that is a beautiful image, and it means something to me. Some people go the whole way the other way and say, in baptism, I am saved by being baptized, or my sins are washed away literally by doing that. So you can be anywhere on that spectrum. But the further along this spectrum you are to it works completely, the more sacramental it becomes. So we're going to look at this idea of sacramental theatre. Can this kind of theatre, and baptism is a kind of theatre, right? Like, you're not actually dying and rising, but you're acting it out in a way. So we're going to look at this through the ways in which the temple works, or one of the ways in which the temple works in Israel. And in some ways, it's them giving themselves hope. It's them giving themselves a future in some ways. It's them recognizing stuff that's gone wrong in the past. It's them trying to fix it, but they do it more with the help of God than they have done previously. There is a bit of a progression going on, which is good. In some ways, it's a coping mechanism for the state that they find themselves in, this fallen state. So to set the scene a bit, we're going to do a bit of a whistle-stop tour to see how we get to the temple from the serpent in the desert. So how do we get to the temple? Well, first of all, after that fall, we have a new creation event. Are we getting tired of these yet? The loops just keep on going. So Joshua leads the people through the Jordan. The Jordan parts, the separation of the waters, they go through on dry land into a good new creation. And there's lots of new creation language going on in Joshua. We don't have time to tap into it properly, but a couple of examples would be the Battle of Jericho is a good example. So a lot of people would talk about the Canaanites as being symbolic of chaos monsters in a lot of ways that need to be quelled in some way or subdued in order for good new creation to come into the promised land. It's not an empty land, it's a land that is occupied and needs to be quelled. Now, Jericho is interesting because there's a couple of things going on. First, they walk around Jericho 6 times before resting on the 7th, which should remind us of the days of creation, right? This is a creation event that they're bringing about. And then Jericho falls. And it's kind of symbolic of the way that, not symbolic, it's, this is how Joshua tends to go through the creation a lot. And he does it through destruction a lot. And I sort of wonder whether that was what God's full intention was. They know what they're trying to do, but I think that they go about slaying chaos monsters a lot more than God does in Genesis 1, where God brings them into being part of the good new creation. And we get a hint of what should be happening actually in Jericho. So the Israelite spies go into Jericho and they take refuge with this prostitute, right? Do you remember this story, the 2 spies? And she, because she's helped them, she's rescued them, she becomes part of Israel. Do you remember what her name is? Rahab. So where else have we heard the name Rahab? Yeah, Rahab is the name of a chaos monster. So if Canaanites are seen as chaos monsters, Rahab is the personification of that. She's even called Rahab, for goodness sakes. But she is not slain. She is brought in to the good new creation. And I feel like that's maybe what should have been happening all along. She's an example of what should be happening. Because in that, I think we see that Israel was never intended to be genetic, right? And you get this sort of drift towards this where, if you're a Jew, then you are saved. Israel was never meant to be that. Rahab is not a Jew, but she's brought into being part of the people of God. She's brought into the good new creation. Ruth, later on, is not a Jew, but she's one of Jesus' ancestors. People brought in. This is what was always meant to happen. It's this Abrahamic promise that you're to bring blessing to all the nations of the earth. You're to bring them towards you, draw them to you. And so we go through and we get to the founding of Israel, and we have all the judges and so on, and they start to establish a kingdom. And this is sort of the building of what they hope is a good creation. And we get to this figure called Solomon, who's King David's son, and he's written very much as an Adamic figure. Like he's what they should hope for. This is the peak of their kingdom. This is the new creation working as it should. So in a couple of chapters we get these descriptions of Solomon. So he requests wisdom, and God gives it to him as a good gift. Right, and we saw this in Genesis, right? Like, wisdom's not a bad thing. Knowledge of good and evil is not a bad thing. But if it's given as a good gift from God, that's way better than grabbing it for yourself. And Solomon asks for wisdom, and God says it's good. The Israelite population is as numerous as the sand. It's a fulfillment of the Abrahamic promise, right? Let's be fruitful and multiply, and let's be as numerous as the sand on the seashore. They're doing what they should be. It's like the people at the beginning of Exodus, right? That they were being fruitful and multiplying. He has peaceful dominion over the nations around him, as the image of God is meant to. He was creative, so he joins with God in creation. He writes poems and songs and proverbs. He's a botanist, so if we're talking about Adam, guarding and keeping and tending the garden, there's a really interesting verse in 1 Kings where it says that Solomon was a botanist and he wrote books on botany, on gardening. And he draws the whole earth to Jerusalem. And this is sort of the end goal of the Abrahamic promise. And Isaiah talks about this a lot. So this is a classic passage from Isaiah. So this is talking about people being brought into Jerusalem and becoming part of this good new creation. It says, "Arise, shine, for your light arrives. The splendor of the Lord shines on you. For look, darkness covers the earth and deep darkness covers the nations." It's a pre-creation state for the other nations, right? This is before Genesis 1 verse 2, 3. They are in a state of chaos, in a state of upheaval, in a pre-creation state. But the Lord shines on you, Jerusalem. His splendor appears over you, and nations come to your light, kings to your bright light. It's like God saying, let there be light. And it brings about this good creation to the nations around them. This is Isaiah's hope. And this is what Solomon is doing. It says that he's drawing nations to Jerusalem. And it's this kind of image that they have. This is the hope that they have for Jerusalem, that it's the city on Mount Zion. And I find it funny that it's called Mount Zion because it's not even really tall enough to be a mountain. But they almost mythologize it into being the tallest mountain on the earth, where Jerusalem looks down over all the earth. And they see it almost, I guess, as like a lighthouse to the nations, where you have Jerusalem as the center of a good new creation, and the wild and waste and the chaos all around them, but they are drawn to the light out of the darkness. That's the image that we're getting. And again, you have this comparison with Eden, where Eden is this place in the midst of a chaotic wilderness, and it's meant to draw people in, it's meant to expand and flourish and bless people. And by the way, this is what Jesus is talking about in the Sermon on the Mount, when he has a crowd of people and he says, you are a city on a hill, you are the light of the world. He's saying that this was never supposed to be about a city, a government, a religious system. This was about people bearing the image of God, being a light to the nations and being a light to everybody else and drawing them into this good creation. It's you who are to bring order out of chaos. And this is the kind of language that Solomon and the people use. And at the center of this city, at the center of Jerusalem, a sort of, I guess, the focal point or the spark of this light, what's at the center of Jerusalem? The temple, right? So this is as the tabernacle in the wilderness was the starting point of a new creation out of which everything was meant to ripple. So the temple functions in that way in Jerusalem. So this is a cross-section of the temple. This one's probably a bit better because you can see all of it. And we're just going to look at some of the ways in which it functions. And it functions in a lot of different ways, the temple. So I'm not going to cover all of them by any stretch, but we're talking here about creation and new creation, and the ways in which stories work as well. So if you have other ideas about the ways that the temple works, I'm not dismissing them necessarily, but there are layers of meaning going on here, and I'm going to look at one of them. So what I want to argue is that the temple acts as a microcosm of the whole universe. It's quite a big statement, right? And the ways in which the priests act within it, particularly on one day of the year, are in accordance with this understanding that it represents everything. So, again, I've put references to evidence for some of the stuff I'm going to say, sort of biblical evidence and things people have written in the footnotes on your handouts. So, I put in my email that if you could read some passages from 1 Kings 6 to 8, that describes the building of the temple by Solomon. So this is when, I was going to say it's when he's still acting as the image of God, but things have started to go wrong at this point. He builds the temple using slave labor, which is not what the image of God should be doing. He's acting more like Pharaoh. But the building of the temple itself is a good thing, sort of. No, the building of the temple itself is a good thing. It's just the way that it's done is not as good as it could have been. So I won't be referencing any stuff from 1 Kings in the footnotes, basically. If it's in there, just have a look for yourself. So let's start outside, and we'll move our way in. So the outer court, all this bit outside the temple, represents the earth. And people can move around freely on that, as they can on the earth. Anyone can go there. So these water basins that we have, the little ones up on the sort of the left-hand side, they're decorated with lions and cattle. So we have animals that populate the earth. And it might maybe allude to Isaiah as well, where it talks about calves and lion cubs lying down together in sort of this perfect new creation. So maybe this is not just the earth, maybe this is the earth as it should be. You also have, and you can probably see it here actually, the massive basin, the bronze laver. That sits on the back of 12 bulls, and there's lily work on it as well, like around the brim it looks like lilies. So you have vegetation and you have animals. The pillars at the entrance to the temple, they also have lilies, and they have pomegranates hanging from the top as well, so maybe evoking the idea of trees maybe. The altar that we see in the top right, that's is prescribed in Exodus how you should build the altar. And it says that you have to build it of uncut bricks and sort of unshaped earth, right? You just sort of mound stuff together. And it makes it look rough, and that's not a good representation of it, because it's not meant to have steps either. But it's meant to be like this rough and ready thing, because it's meant to resemble the mountains on which you traditionally made sacrifices in the old days. So it represents the mountains. Ezekiel 43 even calls it the mountain of God. It says the altar is the mountain of God. I'll skip that. So coming back to this bronze laver, the huge one, it is used for some practical use. It's used for like washing and ceremonial stuff, but it's way too big to be used purely for that. Right? It holds like 40,000 litres of water. It's enormous. So it's symbolic. It represents the waters that are separated at the beginning. And Solomon even calls it the sea. This is the sea. And so what we get is this, and actually maybe in that context then you could say that the smaller basins are rivers or lakes and that kind of thing. So what we get is this picture of the earth, where you have oceans and seas and rivers and mountains and animals and vegetation and people wandering around freely. It's the earth. And then we go back to the pillars, and the pillars are probably represent something like the pillars of earth or the pillars of heaven that hold the earth or hold the heavens up. So this is sort of an ancient view of cosmology. And there's plenty of Bible references to that in your footnotes. Like, they have this understanding of how the world looks. It's probably a flat earth of some description, held up by pillars, and then the skies are held up by pillars as well, at the corners of the earth. And again, I think I mentioned the first week, Robin Parry's book, The Biblical Cosmos, is brilliant for looking at some of this stuff. So these pillars are called, they have names. They're called Yakin and Boaz. And if you put them together, it means the Lord, or He, has established in strength. And Proverbs 8 talks about how God establishes the creation in strength. So this is a creation sort of idea. And you might be like, well, they're pillars, right? They just hold the roof up. You're making far too much of this. Well, they don't hold the roof up. They're too short to hold the roof up. So you can see there's like an overhang over them. They're actually too short to reach the roof. So they're not structural at all. They're purely symbolic. And the overhanging roof probably represents something like clouds or sky. And we think this because, for a few reasons. The first is that there are pomegranates around the top of the pillars. And they're dried pomegranates with the seeds still in. So if you can imagine when you've got an overhang, and the pillar goes up inside the overhang, so you can't actually see the pomegranates. But when there's a bit of a breeze that comes in, they'd rattle in the breeze. So as you're walking underneath and you imagine that the sky and clouds above you, it sounds almost like rain or thunder, right? It's like this 3D experience. And this is sort of enhanced by the storehouses around the outside of the temple. So they are used for practical things like the treasury and all that kind of thing, but they're also symbolic. So Job 38 talks about the storehouses of heaven, in which God houses hail and snow. So you have this idea of the weather systems being around the outside of the temple. So sort of this outer coating of the temple is the clouds, the sky, the weather. And so when you're a priest and you're allowed inside the temple, what you're doing is walking from earth up through the sky, and you're hearing the rain above you, and you have this visual journey, a mental, imaginary journey of leaving the earth and going up through the sky. And you have this idea in Isaiah, I guess, where Isaiah has a vision of being elsewhere, of being not on the earth. And it says in Isaiah 6, he's in the temple when he has this vision, right? He sees the hem of the robe fill the temple. So when you're a priest, you get to walk through, out of the earth, up through the sky, and you go into the inside of the temple. So we're now in the realms of the heavens, the cosmos. So you've gone up through the sky, and on the left, you can just about make out the sort of doorway. The Jewish historian Josephus, he says that covering that doorway is a veil with a panorama of the heavens on it, with stars. So this sort of enhances the sky imagery, right? Like you've gone up through the clouds, up through the rain, and you see the stars ahead of you, and you go through the stars, and suddenly you're in the cosmos. So we're in. So now we're in like the outer bit of the temple. It's called the Hekal. Closest word we have to it in English is probably something like sanctuary, something like that. And you can see that there are windows in there, and these are probably something like the windows of heaven. So there again, the biblical references to this. They believe that things from the heavens come out of windows, and they provide light to the inside. And you have 10 lampstands as well that also provide light. So the effect, actually, if you're outside the temple at night and the 10 lampstands are burning, light will come out of the windows of heaven. So if you imagine that you're looking at the outside of it and you're looking at the sky and the clouds, and you see light coming out, it's almost like the stars shining out of the temple. This is the cosmos that you're looking at. And there are depictions of cherubim on the walls. You can just about make those out. There's a better representation of cherubim in the Holy of Holies that we'll get to in a minute. These giant guardian creatures that we talked about earlier. And it sort of emphasized this idea that this is a realm somewhere between heaven and earth, right? This is the cherubim. They're not earthly creatures. It also might suggest that the Hekal is something of a return to Eden, because as we talked about the image of God, Adam, being this being that dwells somewhere between heaven and earth, right? He's divinity and dust, spirit and soil. He's not quite a creature, but he's not God either. He's a divine mediator between the two. So Eden is a place that functions like that as well. And so when you've left this earth, the perfect sort of representation of what earth could be is Eden. And this is where they are. So you have the cherubim who guard Eden. And maybe that's why they're all along the walls. And it might also explain why only priests could enter. Maybe they are actors acting out being the image of God. They are Adam wandering around the garden as he should. There's vegetation. Loads of images of vegetation in the Hekal. Palm trees and flowers and all this kind of thing. Again, like this Garden of Eden idea. And you have the menorah as well, which is the 7-branched lampstand. And those branches are interesting words to use, right? Because it's almost like the tree of life, these branches. There's a table as well on which bread is placed every week. So the priests go in and they place bread on the table. And after the week has passed, they're allowed to eat the bread, as long as they remain in the Hekal to do so. And it's almost like, do you remember in Eden, Adam, the image of God that he has crafted from the ground, he plants an orchard for him to eat as a good gift. And so if the priests are playing the role of Adam wandering around Eden, they have brought in their offering, they've given it to God, so it's therefore God's to give freely back to them as a good gift for them to eat. And they're allowed to do so after 7 days. This is a creation motif. So if we move beyond the Hekal and we go up these steps, we get to something that's even higher than the heavens, even higher than the cosmos, even higher than Eden. So this is the Devir, or Kadosh Kadosh, the Holy of Holies. And again, you've got cherubim in there, and they're huge. And it says that they only just fit in there, actually. Like they stand wingtip to wingtip, and their wings touch the sides of the Holy of Holies, and the wingtips meet in the middle. And it forms the throne of God. Like, I don't think I've put it in the footnotes, actually, but there's a load of places in the Bible that refer to God being enthroned upon cherubim. And when Solomon dedicates the temple in 1 Kings, the presence of God comes as a cloud. And this is where the presence of God goes. God takes his throne. This is where Isaiah has his vision, right? And he sees the cloud and the presence of the Lord. He saw the Lord seated on the table, and the hem of his robe flows out through the temple. He's seated on his throne, the cherubim. And the Ark of the Covenant containing the law is placed underneath the cherubim, as it was in the tabernacle. So there's a great verse from 1 Chronicles where David is speaking about this temple he plans to build. He says, "I plan to build a house of rest for the Ark of the Covenant of Yahweh, to be a footstool for our God." So if the cherubim are the throne of God, the Ark is his footstool. Elsewhere it talks about justice and righteousness being the footstool of God. It's this idea of God sitting there and justice and righteousness, the law in the Ark, under his feet. So if this is the throne room of God, if they're building a set, right, if they're building a stage, you have the earth in the outer courts, you move up through the sky, up through a symbolic Eden, up through the cosmos, into the throne room of God. The Holy of Holies represents heaven in this image. This is heaven. And the Holy of Holies is a cube. Like it's 20 cubits in every direction. It's sort of this idea of perfection or eternity, and it's overlaid completely in gold. And there are no windows in the Devir. And Solomon himself says, God has said that he will dwell in thick darkness. Not black holes. No, Stephen Hawking reference. Or there's a wonderful verse in Psalm 11. It says, Yahweh is in the temple. Yahweh's throne is in heaven. So it's equated the temple with heaven in some way. This is where God dwells. The presence of God dwells. So actually, interestingly, we have similar imagery in this church. And so if we imagine where we are as the outer earth, and this happens in a lot of churches, by the way, and you'll start to notice it more and more. So the outer earth, we've got like vegetation on the pillars, and there's like flower stuff going on. We have a font, the separated waters. So we have this stuff that happens all the time. And we've got, if we imagine that the chancel is sort of the hekal as we move up through it, we've got all sorts of stuff going on. We've got, I don't think you can see them. We were playing around with lights in the break to see if we could get it working, but on this ceiling of the chancel are painted stars, the stars of heaven. You're sort of symbolically moving up further and further through the cosmos. There are angels painted on the walls, these divine beings that dwell somewhere between heaven and earth. And as you move even further, you get to this place, the Holy of Holies. But there's no curtain separating this. That's interesting, isn't it? Who's allowed to go all the way back there? I know I just did, but don't tell anyone. Who's allowed to go there?
We all are, because we're all priests.
Okay, we all are because we're all priests. Who in the Anglican Church is allowed to go there? The vicar, right? Because the vicar in some ways plays the role of the high priest. Only the high priest can go into the Holy of Holies. Now the vicar does slightly different things in there than the high priest did, because the vicar will receive all of the people for communion. This sort of symbol that actually we can all go there now, which is beautiful. I mean, he still intercedes for us in some way, but he's a priest interceding for a kingdom of priests, and it's really beautiful. But here, only the high priest can go there and see it, and open the doors and see light flood into the Devir for this one time a year. And you can imagine, right, light comes into this place with no windows, but it's overlaid in gold, so the light sort of ricochets everywhere. It must have been spectacular. So why do they put all this effort into this mise en scène, into creating all this stuff, this stage, this set with actors in costumes, with props, with a metaphorical tree of life, with bread that they eat every week? Why do they go to all this effort? Well, various reasons. But the one that we're going to think about briefly is when the high priest does go into the Holy of Holies, the Day of Atonement. And the Day of Atonement is complicated, right? I was trying to sort of read up on exactly what they did, and man, like there's changes of clothes, there's sacrifices, it takes all day, right? So we're not going to do all that. We're going to sort of hone in on a few things that the priest does that are really key for this sort of drama that's to play out, this piece of theatre. So first of all, the high priest. So only the high priest could enter, and he could only enter once a year. So if the temple is a set, he's sort of the lead actor. He's Robert De Niro in this, right? I'm still living in the 70s. Robert De Niro hasn't been a lead actor for a long time. So he plays the true image of God in a lot of ways. And in some ways, maybe God himself, like Moses does, but it's more like the true image of God that he plays in this drama. And he has a costume. And there's one piece of the costume that's really fascinating, and it's, for this at least, it's the sash. And Josephus describes the sash as being like serpent skin, which should make our ears prick up a bit. And he describes how, before performing ministry, he would throw the sash over his shoulder. And a few scholars have sort of made an equation with the idea of God slaying chaos monsters, slaying serpents, which would make sense if we're doing a creation narrative, that you start off by slaying a chaos monster. And so what the high priest would do is he would start off in the earth, and he would, in the outer court, and he would make a couple of sacrifices of a bull and a goat, one for himself and one for the community. And he would take coals from the altar and on a huge shovel, and he'd go up into the sky, up through the cosmos, up through the whole created order, into the Holy of Holies, and he would place the shovel with the burning coals at the foot of the throne of God. And this is probably the image that we're getting in that Isaiah passage, right? Where the seraphim come and take a coal and place it against Isaiah's lips. This is Day of Atonement language with the shovel, the burning shovel, with incense that forms a cloud that represents the presence of God. And that atones for Isaiah's sin. And this is what we're doing at the Day of Atonement. We're atoning for sin. So he comes back out to the earth, and he takes the blood from the goat and the bull, and yeah, there's various back and forth, but we'll sort of condense it for the sake of this. He takes the blood, and he goes up all the way back through the creation to the Holy of Holies, and he sprinkles the blood to make atonement for the sin. And actually, interestingly, there's a rabbinic tradition that, and we don't know how early they started doing this, but that the high priest would stay in the Holy of Holies, in the darkness, the complete darkness, for 3 hours praying for the sins of the people. Which might remind us of Jesus on the cross when darkness comes over him. And he's there for how long? 3 hours. So what happens is that the high priest has gone in, and he's atoned for the sins of the people with blood. And he turns and he walks back out of heaven. And he walks down through the stars that give light. Let there be light. And he walks out. And he walks down through the doors, out into the outer earth, where the people are looking up at him. And they bow down and they worship God. Because what has he done? He has reset the creation for 1 more year. He's gone through this whole set, this whole stage that represents the whole created order. And he's gone and he's reset it. He's restored it for 1 more year. It's a beautiful, beautiful piece of theatre. And they believe that this works. And it does work. The Bible says it works. This is sacramental theatre that's going on here. It's elaborate, and it's huge. And I find it really exciting to see what the priest is doing there. And it really taps into loads of stuff that Jesus does. And I'm sure loads of you are making connections with the stuff that Jesus does, particularly that's written about in the book of Hebrews. It's beautiful, beautiful language. So we're going to finish with a bit of worship as kind of a response to this. And I want to invite you. So we talked in the first session about sin and about displaying our sin and gazing upon it and looking at it. Well, this is the moment where that sin might be atoned for, maybe. God, Jesus has atoned for the sin. He's the true high priest. But if you want to visualize it, get it into your mind, what's actually going on, put it on display and sort of imagine it leaving. Maybe if you're brave enough, go up through and kneel at the rail and confess that sin to God. And then as you walk back out, imagine yourself walking into a new creation, because that's what you are. That's what God has made you. That sin no longer has any hold over you. You aren't doomed to obliteration because of it. Jesus has redeemed it. And you can live in that new creation, but only if you recognize it, only if you step into it for yourself. So we're going to sing, and cheers, Tim, and that was a combination of your names. Tim and CJ. And feel free to respond how you wish to.